Steve asks, does the Bible condone slavery, and did the Jews take slaves?
Now, we had a really interesting conversation about that, where you pointed out that the question, does the Bible condone slavery? Oftentimes it's used like a blunt instrument against Christians because the Bible does speak about relations between slaves and masters.
Yeah.
But this is a situation where we have to understand that there was more than one kind of relationship that you could classify as slavery, correct?
Yeah, and you need to be sensitive to hyperbole because manipulative and albeit dishonest people are going to try to bank on the assumptions people will make right off the bat when they hear the word slavery. Just like if someone, for example, is going to take the life of someone else and they say he committed genocide against those person. Well, genocide and murder both involve killing, but there is a definite distinction between the two. Words matter. So when it comes to the definitions of slavery, at least as how they're put forward or even put on in Scripture, there are four ways that slavery can ultimately be defined. And this, again, is a broad strokes, but we're going to make these distinctions as far as a spectrum is concerned based on one key factor, the amount of rights that you're afforded and that are preserved. Because I don't think even the most ardent atheist would deny that the Bible does give rights to people. It does recognize value in people, maybe not to the degree that they would as humanists, but nonetheless ones that do exist. So in this spectrum, what we're going to do is basically define slavery, and hopefully you can see this all listening as fair, as the position in which you're supposed to do what you're told. The only difference between these different forms of slavery, when you're told to do something, you're supposed to do it, is how many rights you're afforded while in that position. So obviously the most familiar form of slavery that people will view and will automatically impose whenever the word comes up is chattel slavery. You're supposed to do what you're told and you have no rights afforded to you.
On pain of death.
Yes, we can see this in exercise during the time of the Roman Empire and pagan Norse and, well, basically every pagan society. We see this in action with the transatlantic and the trans-Saharan slave trade, the latter not as often talked about. The fact that you are considered a farming tool and nothing more. If you were killed, there was no legal penalty against you. This was an actual form of slavery that's still going on today, by the way. And when we note that, we see it as an evil because no rights are afforded to someone bearing the image of God. On the exact opposite end of the spectrum, the Apostle Paul made a comparison in the book of Ephesians of a child being a form of a slave. The only problem is that every right was afforded to them to the same degree as if they were a master. But like the chattel slavery individual, they had to do what they were told.
The connection being Paul saying to children, obey your parents in the Lord.
Right, and that he also made a note of contrast in saying, this is also in Galatians as well, a slave is no different than a child in that he is subject to his father, his master. But when he is full grown, then he bears all rights of the master. And he makes this point. But notice the common theme, the definition. Slave, someone who has to do what they're told. What's the difference between types of slaves? The rights afforded to you. Zero rights is chattel slavery. Full rights is a child. Now let's tick the spectrum back from the child to what we would call modern day employment, that someone is afforded rights of a certain time that they have to do what they're told, but other times where they're free to go and live their lives.
I should probably just clarify this for those watching. The reason I was kind of laughing was I can remember saying to my dad when he'd tell me to go out and do weeding or something, I'm not your slave, and then I found I really was.
Yeah,
but go ahead.
And that's the child spectrum. You have to do what you're told. So noting that point, you have workman's compensation, you have sick days, these sort of things are in a position where you have to do what you're told, but rights are preserved, whether it's through unions or whatever. You can take your pick politically. But note the point that we're making. In slavery, and I'm repeating this because it is that much of a manipulated issue, I want to make sure I'm not misunderstood. A child, full rights. Employment, most rights. Chattel slavery, no rights. What is the Bible's position? Well, not quite in this position, but there's another form of slavery that would be a tick above chattel slavery. We call it indentured servitude. And note, I'm not saying yet this is where the Bible's position is. It was a form of it, but we need to make sure we define our terms from the Bible itself. And before I can do that and communicate effectively, you need to understand what I mean. Chattel slavery, no rights. Indentured servitude, some rights. Employment, most rights. Child, full rights. In indentured servitude, you were selling yourself into a position where, as is our definition of slavery, a position where you have to do what you're told for a period of time until you worked off your debt. Now, modern depictions in art, like Star Wars, for example, in The Mandalorian, the Ugnaught character played by was it Nick Nolte?
Yeah.
He was a indentured servant to the Empire, but the Empire prolonged his debt to the point where they could keep him in slavery longer. That would be an abuse, but still a form of indentured servitude that we see exercised throughout history. We saw it in medieval Europe. We saw it abused in Israel's history, but not in Israel's law. Note that point. But these were forms of slavery that existed throughout the ages.
And one of our ancestors on my grandfather's side actually came to the United States as an indentured slave.
Yeah. So when we're talking about, and I'm repeating this because I will be misunderstood, and I want to make sure you're all understanding what I'm talking about here. When I'm in the position of a slave, I'm in a position where I have to do what I'm told. In a chattel slavery position, the one that's almost universally understood, when the word slave comes up, that means I'm afforded no rights when I'm supposed to do what I'm told. Indentured
As in
servant,
the people of Israel under the Pharaoh of Egypt.
right.
That would be chattel slavery.
Indentured servitude, that would be a form of slavery where some rights are afforded to you, but not much. It's a
Like
step above.
Jacob, when he was working for 7 years to be able to receive the ability to marry Rachel.
Yeah, he had the right to put himself in that position as opposed to most chattel slavery. They were just kidnapped and put
But
in
he
that
had to
position,
do
of course.
everything that
Laban told him,
his father-in-law Laban told him. Yeah.
Above that would be modern day employment. You have many rights afforded to you, but while you're on the hour, there are penalties if you don't do your job. And of course, a child, full commitment, you have to do what you're told position, but there are a lot of legal penalties if you abuse or treat your child as a slave driver. You get the point. So when we're talking about this issue, what does the Bible say when it's describing slavery? Well, even then, slavery is not an appropriate translation because there is a word, like is used in Exodus, for the way that Pharaoh treated the people of Israel. But when the law of Moses was given down, when the covenant was made with God's people, they were growing up in a world where they themselves had only ever known slavery, where the world at large for the next 1,500 years would know nothing apart from who's a slave and who isn't. And until, and you can read this even acknowledged by atheist scholars like the author of Dominion, let me get his name here in a moment, the reality was until Judeo-Christian values had dominated the public mind, these things were and still are the sort of things that were just the status quo. Now, when we're talking about this issue, one moment, I want to get the name of the individual here. Dominion, it was a record of the history of the Christian world. Tom Holland was his name. I always have that name in my head, but I'm thinking, oh, wasn't that Spider-Man?
Yeah.
Anyway, Tom Holland, the author, not the actor.
Not Spider-Man. But
Yes.
the other guy.
Let's be clear about that.
Yeah, Third Peter. Anyway, when we're talking about this issue, excuse me, I want to make sure I cite my sources. Israel's position of slavery, chattel slavery, indentured servitude, employment, family. Israel's form of slavery, the kind that's outlined for them in the law, the one that God said, this is how you're supposed to exercise what you have and what the world will continue to always know, would fit right here. And for those listening on Reach Radio, I had 4 examples, holding up 4 fingers. My finger, the 5th one, is right in the middle. They would have rights afforded to them, but they were still in a less than favorable position. So where do I get that from? Well, I'm not just going to say it to hand wave and get myself out of a difficult conversation. This is text from Scripture. Exodus chapter 21, the first law after the 10 Commandments that was given to Israel, the first thing that they needed to know after the moral and overall spiritual codes that would outline their lives for them. Exodus 21, these are the judgments which you shall set before them. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out free and pay nothing. Now, already there's a condition for why he's being bought, how he is entering into that position, and for how long maximum he will serve in that position.
Right.
So you're right. As a Hebrew servant, and I'm going to be careful with my words here because language matters, is maximum 6 years. Second, it's only going to be in the circumstances of him being bought because he has to pay something. But what's also interesting is noting the life he'll live during that time. In verse 3, it says, if he comes in by himself, he shall go out by himself. If he comes in married, his wife shall go out with him. If his master has given him a wife, that's an interesting environment. And she has borne him sons or daughters, and the wife and her children shall be her master's. He shall go out by himself. Now, here's where we get the exception. What if someone was wanting to be a servant for longer? This is what's called a bondservant, a term that's used deliberately by people like James in the New Testament, describing his relationship with God. And the literal translation would be what? A slave by choice. It says in verse 5, but if the servant plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free. Then his master shall bring him to the judges. He also shall bring him to the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear with an awl. This isn't beating him. This is giving him an earring. And he shall serve him forever. And note this as well. If you're in a male servant status, these are your conditions. Maximum service, maximum opportunities for relationships and how he's to leave, and a provision for him to stay if he wants to. And note, who is the one who has to approve this bond service? Is the master just going to say, I don't want to give you up. Come here, give me your ear. He has to be brought before the judges.
Right.
This has to be a public statement made in front of their legislation.
Right.
And by the way, if he was being coerced into it, what better place to announce than the presence of those with control of the military?
Yeah.
So note that point when it's strawmanned by
Who did not bear the sword for no purpose. Yeah.
when it's strawmanned by atheist groups and humanists who would make this point and saying, oh yeah, Israel, they use a lot of loopholes, but these Christians, they just want to enslave everybody. Yeah, Handmaid's Tale is boring. Anyway, verse 7 notes, what about women? If a man sells his daughter to be a female slave, she shall not go out as the male slaves do. So she's not just going to be sold in any context like a man would. If you're in a position where you're being sold to pay off a debt, your debt, and you have to do what you're told, here are the rights afforded to a woman. If she does not please her master, who has what? Betrothed her to himself. The only condition for men was what? In context of payment of debt. The only context in which women were put in this situation was a betrothal. That's all that's mentioned. But notice this, then he shall let her be redeemed. Redeemed, that's usually referred to in terms of like, a great feeling of liberation, but it's literally to be given back value, that you're put out of that position of debt. And it notes this point, he shall have no right to sell her to a foreign people, since he has dealt deceitfully with her. And if he has betrothed her to his son, he shall deal with her according to the custom of daughters. And if he takes another wife, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, and her marriage rights. If he does not do these 3/4, then she shall go out free without paying money. So notice the points repeated again. If she sells herself in debt, it's in the context of marriage, period.
Right.
If a man sells himself, it is in the payment of debt or nothing, and for a maximum of 6 years. And if this man is to treat her in any way as a servant, it's the way you treat your daughter, if it's to your son, or to a wife, period. Now you say, well, they could still beat them within an inch of their life. It says right here that, oh, I was hoping that you didn't look it up. Verse 26, the same chapter. If a man strikes the eye of his male or female servant and destroys it, he shall let him go free for the sake of his eye. And if he knocks out the tooth of his male or female servant, he shall let him go free for the sake of his tooth. This isn't saying that, dentists got to work too. It's making the point that if you cause any cosmetic harm to your servant, you have lost the right to be their master. So rights are afforded for not only how long you served, the circumstances in which you are serving, but also the situation, the treatment of you as a human being despite being a servant. And then you say, well, can they just kidnap people and force them in these situations? No, Exodus 24 states very plainly that whoever steals a man is going to be put to death. So, chattel slavery does not fit if we're going to apply that to the Bible. You can't kidnap people. You can't mistreat people in a physical way.
Can't coerce them into it. Yeah.
And of course, you can't keep them for longer than 6 years unless you're getting married to them. Now, some women may say that's slavery, and you can tell why they're single. The idea of indentured servitude is a form of it. I love these offhand remarks, if you note my smarminess. Is in a way the circumstances of how this was to work, but in other nations that practice indentured servitude, did they afford these rights to women? No. So you have to note there's a difference between that face value, something that can be manipulated, coerced, or even prolonged, and what the Bible spells out plainly. Because as I recall, what was one of the reasons why Saul was disqualified from his position as king of Israel? He wasn't setting the captives free on the 6th year. So note that point. God takes the treatment of his people seriously, even if they weren't so wise with their financial decisions. Are they like modern day employment? No, they weren't afforded nearly as many rights as we benefit from in the United States and most areas of Europe. And were they considered children? If you were a woman in that position, yes, you were supposed to be. And note, does that mean they always were? Also, no. But when the question is phrased, does the Bible condone slavery? You have to ask again, what kind? Many rights were afforded that disqualify this from being compared to the forms of slavery that we think are the only ones that exist.
The ones that happen in the United States, for instance.
And also the forms of slavery that are still being practiced in Muslim countries and some areas of Asia and Europe as well are all basically directly condemned and considered capital punishments. But if we're also going to say that this is where the Bible fits them, it would also be inaccurate. When Israel was given these laws, it was moral principles on how you were to treat people if you were in a situation where you needed to pay off debt. We need to make sure that we don't allow people to set terms for language and manipulate people in this way. Because, and again, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt, Steve, you're probably asking this either out of curiosity or because someone else leveled this to you. But 99 times out of 100, when people level this question, they're not actually looking for an answer, because if they actually cared about historical inquiry and the treatment of human beings, they probably would have read the Bible, as well as maybe the historical background of this. Again, Tom Holland's Dominion's an excellent overview of Christian history from a secular perspective, and noticing this is very different from how the status quo is in pagan Europe.
Right.
Why was it that the introduction of Christian values, though at times draconian they were, it was a Christian abusing the law that came up with that term, by the way, they were not representing the person of Jesus Christ. They were not acting out the standards that were laid out by Moses. And if we're going to ask, well, is that the way that Christians ought to treat people because, insert this person's name here. If that name isn't Jesus of Nazareth, I don't want to hear about it. And if that term, that activity, isn't coming from Scripture, then again, I don't want to hear about it. And if you even look in Scripture and say, well, the Scripture says to do that, but people did something different. No kidding.
Yeah.
The Bible is honest history, and it told them what you're doing is wrong.
2 words, golden calf.
Yeah.
There
So
you
go figure. Because the Bible uses the term servant or some translation slave does not mean that it condones every form of slavery. Because pop culture and media have emotionally manipulated people into only thinking of chattel slavery when this word comes up in order to demonize Christianity and Judaism, does not mean that they're telling the truth or representing accurate history. Were Israelites required to own slaves? No. Could they? Yes. What kind? Read it. Exodus 21. But if that is not on the interest of the person who's asking the question or that you're talking to, Steve, be very careful about wasting your time, because that's all that's ended up going to be done.
So the most important thing when that hot button issue comes up is to ask people, what do you mean by slavery? And then have them define it, correct?
Right. And if they give an inaccurate or an uncomparable definition to that which the Bible stands out, you got a great opportunity, because then you can say, well, I agree, that's horrible. It's a good thing the Bible doesn't have anything related to that kind of slavery.
Yeah.
They say there's only one kind of slavery. So great. So the Bible doesn't condone slavery because it's not your definition.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So, very, very important to get people to define their terms. And there's nothing wrong in a conversation like that, in a very measured and, again, giving people the benefit of the doubt sort of way, just saying, well, could you tell me exactly what you mean by slavery?
Right.
Because that's going to save talking past each other.
Yeah.
That's one of I think the huge problems that we get into when we share our faith with non-believers is oftentimes we're not defining our terms the same way.
Yeah.
And so you're talking past one another. I remember sharing with a veteran Mormon missionary who told me that Mormons believe that you are saved by grace through faith. That's how you enter into salvation.
Yep.
And that befuddled me, because everything I knew about Mormonism is it's a works-based system. Fortunately, there was an ex-Mormon there who said, well, elder, tell him what you mean by saved. And he got silent, and he said, well, he knows he's lying to you or deceiving you. What he means by saved is that you get a body for judgment. That's all it means. You can be eternally lost and be saved by his definition.
Oh, wow.
But unless you know that, you're
Yeah.
talking past each other.
Right. Defining the terms, like you said.
and both ways. When I say saved, that's the mindset that
Right.
the Mormon would have. When the Mormon uses the term saved, and oftentimes it is, in a sense, not on the most ethical footing, they're using it in a completely different term. So
Yeah.
really important that we get our terms
Yeah.
straight.
And I'm always aware when I'm talking to people of not using Christianese. Around here you can use these words, even like saved, but to someone who doesn't know anything about God or the Bible, then we got to be, think about how we can present that in a way that it's not Christianese and just words that only we.
Yeah, you don't want to get your definition of saved from a Macaulay Culkin movie.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly.
Good to define our terms.
Yes, that's
yeah.
very good.